Sweet in the morning, oh Lord, it's sweet in the morning.
Just for the record, Chuck, to start out, give me your name, full name.
Charles Morgan, Jr.
And you were born where?
1930, across the river in Cincinnati, Ohio.
And you grew up your early years,
First 15 years in Kentucky.
and you came to Birmingham. Just give me a little back.
1945.
Okay. Your father did what?
He was the manager of the National Life and Accident Insurance Company.
And when you moved to Birmingham, you lived where?
Hmm?
Where'd you live in
Why,
Birmingham?
in Mountain Brook.
You say that as if there was no other place.
Well, there was certainly no other place at the time that anybody in their right mind wanted to live,
Why was that?
because it was a precious little kingdom. It was a nice little upper middle class, very upper middle class white community. And the people who lived there were socially acceptable. It contained 2 country clubs and a lot of white folk.
And so that's why your family moved there.
My family moved there because it was the best residential section in town.
And did your father feel very much a part of the white power structure?
No.
Talk about that just a little bit so we get some background. I'm trying to find out.
In the first place, the last thing in the world that my father would have thought of moving to Birmingham was something called, quote, the white power structure, end quote. I doubt that many people in Birmingham thought of themselves as power structure. Many people in Birmingham thought of themselves as white or black. And the power structure in Birmingham was pretty clearly defined. It was United States Steel.
Did your father sell insurance to United States Steel? Is that what brought him here? I'm trying to get a little background, Chuck, to come
No,
to
he
your
worked
attitudes.
for the National Life and Accident Insurance Company out of Nashville, Tennessee. My father was born in the mountains in Kentucky. My mother was born in Paducah. Paducah was in western Kentucky. That's more the land of noblesse oblige. Where my father was born, there were no slaves, and no slave history. So one of the best things he could do in this entire world was to get out of the place that he was born, literally in a cabin, which would have been in a suburb of, I guess, Lackey, which would have been a suburb of Allen, which would have been a suburb of Prestonsburg. So he was quite interested in doing that, and he hit the road and he got himself a job, and he worked his way up inside the National Life and Accident Insurance Company, which was out of Nashville.
You came here and you were approximately 15, correct?
Yeah. Incidentally, they had a large industrial insurance business. Industrial insurance was insurance in the South that was generally sold to black folks, whether it was that company or even the few black-owned insurance companies. And so a person who worked for such an insurance company or ultimately managed it, he had to know an awful lot about living conditions amongst black folks. Go ahead.
Okay, you went to high school then when you got here. 3 years, 2 years?
I went to high school. I went to Birmingham University School, and I went to Ramsey High School, from which I graduated.
Then you went to the University of Alabama.
Mm-hmm.
Why did you do that as opposed to going up east like a lot of your contemporaries did? Why did you go to Tuscaloosa?
Well, I didn't even think about going up east, and not a lot of my contemporaries did. Some of them did. It was and the University of Alabama was the state university. I was out of school a bit early. I'd skipped a grade someplace down the line, and I was, I suppose, 17 or whatever. And I started out at the university. It was the state university. It was a fine place to go.
What year?
I never even considered the other places.
Okay, but you got interested the minute you got down there in student politics. I mean...
Well, it wasn't that moment. No, I didn't do that the first minute I got there. It took a while. I was interested in student politics because that was a thing in the state of Alabama to be interested in.
And you wanted to be a politician yourself?
Well, I don't think that's true, no. I didn't think I wanted to be a politician. I just was interested in politics.
Deal with those years in Tuscaloosa particularly, because that just precedes the Arthurine Lucy entrance. But were you in Tuscaloosa at the time the Supreme Court decision came down, Brown versus the Board of Education?
Sure. I started at the University of Alabama in 1947. I left the University of Alabama in 1955. Brown v. Board was 1954. Arthurine Lucy had filed suit before that.
Talk a little bit about those years, Chuck. I mean, you took a very strong position in favor of Brown. You took a strong position in favor of Arthurine Lucy.
Well, that's right, but you see, I didn't have a strong pulpit to speak from. I mean, a strong position did not mean that I was suddenly going to broadcast nationwide and say, hi there, folks, this kid at the University of Alabama favors Brown v. Board. But people at the university knew generally that not only I, but many others, whites, thought that the outcome in Brown v. Board should be precisely what it was, that desegregation was unconstitutional. There were a goodly number of white folks, even though many people today don't remember it, don't want to, or, weren't there. A good many folks in Alabama were pretty liberal. You got to remember, Alabama was far more liberal than most northern states on most issues.
Except race.
No, I don't give that away either. I think that there are a lot of northern states which, starting in about 1948, with the grace of Franklin Roosevelt's presidency over the years and Harry Truman's campaign on a civil rights plank, that decided that there was something called civil rights and they had to take a position, so they took a position in favor of it and of them. Now in Alabama, they took a position generally against them. Alabama seceded from the Democratic Party when Harry Truman was nominated in 1948. I remember that.
You were there, were you not?
The Dixiecrat Convention was here. And my father attended the thing and all that sort of stuff and everything, and they went out. But you see, what had happened in Alabama was you always had Alabama was far to the left of most states in the Union with respect to its senatorial representation, members of the House, and in 1946, its governor.
You're talking now about Jim Folsom.
Why, of course.
And that's the one that you worked very hard for. That was your first political campaign.
Not 46, no. I was still in school, still in high school. But as far as I was concerned, and Folsom was never, Folsom was never respectable inside the precious little kingdom, nor was he ever respectable inside any other of the Birmingham industrial centers of power. But Folsom was a person that I saw when I was 16 years old, when he first, I guess that was his first successful run. And I can remember him running, and I thought he was, probably thought he was kind of a funny fella. I mean, after all, he'd lie down and do anything else it took to get publicity or be in the newspapers. But he never said he hated anybody. And he always said quite the contrary. So I think I and a goodly number of people who were in Mountain Brook didn't talk about being for Jim Folsom. We didn't even know that race was a major issue at the time. But that's what Folsom did, and then came the 48 convention, and he led the Loyalists. So by 1948, when I was at the University of Alabama, I knew that there was a difference between Loyalists and Dixiecrats. And soon along the way, I had to make up my mind whether I was on one side or the other, and a number of us made up our minds that we were on the side of the Loyalists. And I wasn't at all isolated or alone in that. And the entire Hill-Sparkman organization, even though Hill and Sparkman were not noteworthily to the left on the race question, the entire Folsom operation, everybody in the state made a decision with respect to all the loyal Democrats, had to know that they were on the side of the political party that included the black folks, and did so nationally. Now, many of them wrestled mightily to get free of that. George Wallace was a Loyalist. He and George Hawkins, whose campaign I worked in and managed lately, and worked on in 58. All those kinds of people that were around, this was a big labor center. I mean, you can't look around Birmingham, Alabama and not understand that there were disputes between laboring people who were black and those who were white. And the one thing the steel workers and the CIO unions had to do was to get rid of that rivalry between the two. And
or you could say that again, get rid of the rivalry, or sort of put it and stimulate it so that blacks and whites would be working against each other.
Not with the steel workers. The steel workers wanted them working together.
Okay, you're talking about
One
steel
thing,
workers.
they didn't work. I mean, white folks had, some of the times when white plant owners and others would have a strike or something of the white workers, they would try to bring black folks in as strike breakers, and sometimes they were successful, and that made them very unpopular in that circumstance too. The only way that you organized in the mine workers or the steel workers was to make sure that racial barriers did not exist so that they couldn't run in strike breakers. And this was not the conservative city that everybody sees. It was conservative in the state. The state itself was conservative, as race is the measure, but on other issues, it was far to the left of much of the country.
So you then became, can I fairly say this, first, before you got involved as a civil rights attorney, you became very much an economic kind of liberal.
By the time I graduated from the University of Alabama Law School, I taught a course 4 times called American Economic History. I didn't just wake up one day and said, hey, I like economics or whatever it is, but I actually did that as I was going through school. Now, I was always interested in that. I developed a certain degree of scholarship at the University of Alabama because I had to. I'd been too interested in politics and other things. So I finally had to make almost all A's for 4 or 5 semesters to get an average that could get me into law school. And then when I got to law school, it became a habit, so I did the same thing in law school, and I was an honorary student in the law school. But I've had different interests in life. And as they have approached me, then sometimes the world has been interested in what I've been interested in. Sometimes it hadn't. That hadn't bothered me too much. I've just had to, move through those things. And I could always look at Alabama a little differently than a lot of folks did, because I knew some of the contrasts that existed in it. I mean, when you grew up in post-World War II and you had Jim Folsom as governor, and he was not going to cuss the black folks, and you had Lister Hill and Sparkman. You started off, I guess, as a senator named Bankhead along the way. And you had all these people, and these were returning veterans of World War II. One of the things World War II did for an awful lot of people that is forgotten today is it told them that there was such a thing as democracy, and that Hitler was a racist, and that Mussolini was a fascist, and the Nazis were on the other side. And the Japanese, of course, were of another race who was more comfortable fighting them, no doubt. But the fact of the matter is that these people were fascist totalitarians, and a lot of young men came back from the war. And they went to the University of Alabama, and I'm sure other southern campuses too, but certainly in Alabama. And those folks came back, and they'd lived in a world whereby they'd been defending what they thought was democracy. And many of them saw that what they were living in was not. I wasn't alone in that.
But Chuck, if these people came back from the Second World War, and that's both blacks and whites, because Truman did desegregate the Army. That was the first time
But that's right. But you see, the Truman desegregation of the Army wasn't in the middle of the pitched battle of World War II, but go ahead.
Yes, it came afterwards. But the important thing was there was that change. Those veterans came back, both white and black. But they came back and went to school, and by 1954 came this Supreme Court decision, and everything changed. I mean, what you call the liberal state or the liberal city closed its doors, did it not? I mean, it said we shall not desegregate our public schools.
I don't think I've ever accused Birmingham of being a liberal city.
I thought you said that it was a lot more liberal than the rest of the state in everything but race.
Oh, you're talking about with organized labor? Yes, until you saw the people who were actually living at the country clubs and running the town, owning it.
Okay,
the ones who owned it were the, except for Pittsburgh people. I mean, Pittsburgh owned the place, lock, stock, and mill. But the rest of the folks around here all did business with Pittsburgh, so they were pretty conservative. But inside the other segments of the society where laboring people worked, 25,000 of them, 50,000 of them in unions and in mines, those folks were not exactly what you'd call people who worshipped at the altar of Mammon, as you'd say.
What about, let's take that time, and I want to go back to Tuscaloosa again and the Arthurine Lucy situation there, but let's take that 54 situation. Everything actually changed then in this city. There seemed to be a wall that came down and said, we are not going to change. Atlanta didn't take that approach. Why do you think Birmingham did?
Every city took that approach in the South. The entire South took that approach. When the Cotton Curtain, which had always been there anyway, it just was molded into a wall when Brown v. Board came, because people had been making up their minds for years before Brown v. Board. And segregationist politicians who were generally representative of the rich, the well-born, and the able certainly moved in 1954 as they had in 1948, when they used the race question to take the Democratic Party away. And they did exactly the same thing then. Now, at that point, you had certain noted politicians, Bull Connor, Theophilus Eugene, I think was his given name, and all those people. And they were really pawns for a good many number of white folks whose names I could mention. I think I won't right now.
Why?
But because I don't choose to.
All right.
But these folks were in the area, and they were conservative beforehand, and they were conservative after that. But the race issue gave them something really to talk about, because now they could talk in terms of segregated schools and all the phrases they might have used. I remember one speaker, niggers are taking over your schools, niggers are taking over your churches, niggers are taking over all those kinds of things, and consequently they had great power. And that was true not just in Birmingham, that was true in the, across much of the South. Birmingham was always rawer and tougher than the rest of the South. Atlanta had a business community and a semblance of an educational community inside the city. And you had in Birmingham, you didn't have much of that. The people who did business here did business through U.S. Steel. They did business with U.S. Steel. If you mined coal, you sold it someplace. If you were an ore miner, or if you owned an ore mine, you got rid of it there, if U.S. Steel didn't already own it. And all the rest of the steel companies, this was just that place. We're talking about 50,000 folks around here who are eating.
So you're saying that this cry against black folks fell on very fertile ground because people were built with lack of education or whatever the case may be.
And traditionally, if possible, when white labor went on a strike, black folks they tried to bring black folks in, and convict and prison labor sometimes, to break the strike. And that didn't, there was not a unity of working together. Only a couple of labor unions managed to put that together and work together so they could get organized.
Well,
they did a good job of that.
Let's go back to Tuscaloosa and the Arthur and Lucy case, because you, in your book, One Man, One Voice, cite the fact that you had called Arthur and Lucy when she came, and she mentioned that she heard from this young white man, and you were the one that called her. But the university didn't do anything towards bringing her in. Did you want to do something about bringing her into the university?
Well, yeah, but you see, there's nothing that I would. I'm not. Let me explain. To ask the question in this time, and to think about the question, say in 1947 through 1955, would I have wanted to bring her to the University of Alabama? Sure. But would I want her to enter the University of Alabama? Sure. But would I want to have a means to do that? Sure. And did I have any conceivable means to do that? No. The only thing I had was I had some influence on the campus from time to time in the ways that some people did, and I could just assure her that we would have that matter worked out when she got admitted, that everybody would be a peaceful admission, and it wouldn't be bad. And that could have been done easily.
Were you in law school then?
Not when she got in, but she came in 56. I was out of law school in 55, but she came in 56, as I recall it.
How did you begin to work with people like Orzel Billingsley and Arthur Shores? I mean, what was the connection there in the beginning? Because your career goes on, interestingly, defending a lot of very unpopular positions, Chuck. I mean, that's what you're noted for.
Well, the defense of unpopular positions did not feed me to start with. But, let's just go back.
Let's go back.
When I got out of the University of Alabama, I understood Alabama very well. I had finished near the top of my class in law school, if not at it. I knew I had come out of Alabama with a couple of degrees. I knew a lot of people. I had worked in campus politics and activities and in Young Democrats' work and in Democratic state politics well before I got out of the University of Alabama. I left the University of Alabama at age 25. By the time I left Alabama, I understood the Hill-Sparkman bunch, the Young Democrats, everything else that I was involved in. I was National Committee of Young Democrats, I guess, before I ever got out of school. Now, I knew state politics, and I knew state politicians. And they knew me, and they knew I was a little strange in some beliefs. Some of them did. But a great number of them agreed with me. Now, the fact that I wind up saying something and am known for saying something, or breaking loose that way, was not by my pre-design. I didn't wake up one day and said, "Hi there, there's a revival, I'm going to do something." It is just that some people were confronted with having to make a decision. Most people wanted to avoid that decision. I was sane. I certainly would have preferred to avoid it making the decision. I already had made my mind up as to how I felt about things, and I said it. But I sure didn't want to be confronted with something that would strike me away from the entire community or town.
Then
or the
why
state.
did you? Why did you?
Because I wasn't smart enough to turn it down. I couldn't figure a way out where I could live with myself. I didn't have the capacity to rationalize, apparently, that other people did. And I was confronted. Confrontation is what changes people. Their minds are already made up generally. They know what they think, and they know what it is, and they know whether they can live with themselves or not. So once confronted, then you make a choice.
All right, what was the first confrontation that you said it didn't pay the bills? What paid your bills in the beginning when you took out?
Well, I mean, law practice. I mean, law, I'm not sitting down there looking for a civil rights case. That's crazy. I suppose as you get into things, you think about things. For instance, I was already active in politics to a degree and already involved in the liberal, loyalist, the loyalist wing of the Democratic Party. There were loyalists and Dixiecrats. We were loyalists. And in that context, people knew what people thought. I mean, there were folks in the crowd that knew. And when you go through it and you're suddenly someplace and you're thinking about this, and you've watched everything go, then at some point you either have to make a decision and a choice. For instance, if you represent somebody, you're appointed to defend someone in a criminal case, then you have to make a decision. You've accepted the appointment. They paid $100 back then for a capital case. That means if the fella could face capital punishment, you got $100 from the state of Alabama to defend that person. Now, one of the reasons some lawyers would do that, even those like I did when I started out with a corporate firm here or something, one reason lawyers did that is because if they were young, they wanted to learn something. Well, they also did not want to be, at least I did not want to be, known as Death House Morgan. That was a fear that was beyond me. I didn't want to be known as a fellow who had managed to have anybody who got killed. Now, once you're presented with a case and you go ahead and you handle it, you start learning more and more about things as you go. It's not just law or rationality, it's facts and circumstances. And one case after another case after another case, you wind up doing things. And you know the strangest thing happens? That all of your friends and associates, all of whom are associated with you in one activity or another, seem to develop a propensity to find out that they can send you a case that they wouldn't handle.
Why did you never turn it down?
Well, I didn't. I had a different perception of things. I didn't want to take some cases sometimes and get out there in those damn things any more than anybody else did. I was crazy. But my perception of being a lawyer was different from that of a lot of people.
Deal with that a little bit. Let's go back to deal with some of the cases that gave you high visibility that led up to your leaving in '64. I'm thinking of you taking, for example, the Alabama Council on Human Relations, the Bob Hughes case, the Norman Jemison case. There were no attorneys that would handle that in Birmingham.
Well, there probably were some lawyers. There were no, we're talking about white lawyers.
Yes, I'm talking about, well, because there was segregated juries, and we're going to get to that in a minute.
Right. Well, there were some white lawyers, probably, who would have taken those cases. A few. And those lawyers were unknown, often to me, but certainly to the clients. Now, when someone comes to you and they have a problem, then the first thing you want to do is shun it off to somebody else. I was never a member of the Council on Human Relations. I was hardly ever, I was a member of the Young Men's Business Club, primarily because at least it was an organization that had some controversy to it. I mean, it was in a world in which the Junior Chamber of Commerce was over here and the Young Men's Business Club was over there, I got to the YMBC. And we had debates in that thing. It was really very strange in Birmingham that somebody would do that sort of thing, a group or an organization would. And we had folks there that were, good people confronting things. Well, as far as I was concerned, the last thing in the world I wanted to do as I got up in the morning was to go out and confront the race question. And the reason for that was that I had done very well, and I was not what you would call ignorant of the world in which I lived. I mean, I'd traveled the state in politics. I'd done a world of things. I knew everybody from, I had people who were interested in me. People, Mark Ray Clement in Tuscaloosa, others, Jim Folsom, all those folks around. I mean, Folsom, Hill, and Sparkman, I got along with all these folks. Now, the last thing in the world they wanted me to do, any of them that knew me well, would be to get involved in an immigration case, because it was unheard of. You got to be out of your mind to do that. Well, I wasn't out of my mind, obviously. It's worked out very well over the long haul. I couldn't foresee any of it. But you see, what happens is that when you are confronted in life, you make certain decisions. And the decisions you make generally govern the rest of your life in certain instances. And when you make those decisions, you begin to move, even if your moves cut you away from the community. And one leads to another, because you don't live in a vacuum. If Joe Jones over here knows something happened, he may tell Bill Green, who tells Sam Smith. And Sam then knows somebody, and pretty soon you wind up with another client. And you say, where did that client come from? Well, it came because of the first one. And it could be that your capacity to rationalize wasn't as, you weren't that rational a person, perhaps. Now, I didn't have any question but that what was right. And I knew I was an American citizen. And there was a Supreme Court of the United States. And as such, all those things entered into it. There was a certain sense of patriotism. And if you took a case, then you tried to win it. And you win it any number of ways. Settle it, do this, get the case dismissed, do everything. I did all those things I could. And you just wound up repeatedly getting in those things. And when you did wind up repeatedly getting in them, it wasn't that you couldn't foretell the future. You just didn't know what else to do other than whatever your duty was. As I said, it wasn't my duty to join the Council on Human Relations. I didn't race over every day to see if I could attend an NAACP meeting. I mean, that wasn't in my interests. I didn't wake up one morning thinking that was a fine thing for me to do. I didn't go join some debating society. Young Men's Business Club's as close as they came to that around here. I didn't do that. All that happened was things happened. And invariably, when I'd get in a case, then some son of a bitch would come along and would anger me a little bit along the way. And that would just, increase my resolve. Now, in fact, looking back at it, I have a lot to be thankful for Birmingham. I got out of here alive.
Yes.
I got out of here well. I came back here for years. I still do. I used to say I didn't lose any old friends. I just made new enemies. And I didn't do anything particularly noteworthy, you see.
But Chuck,
I was a lawyer.
I know. Hey, stop right there, though. And we must talk a little bit about the climate for white folks at that time and what it was like if you dared speak out. For example, one of the cases when you came back into town, a classic that you recite in your book, is that you're down here at the Parliament House having lunch and somebody saw you and went across the street. It was shortly after the city had desegregated the lunch counters and so forth. And they said they'd rather eat across the street with a group of niggers than sit in the same hotel room with Chuck Morgan.
That's right.
Obviously, you weren't the
that didn't offend me. But
it didn't offend you. How did you put up with that? I mean, you knew people and they resented you. You were not the most dearly loved man in Birmingham.
You know something, this may come as a big surprise to you, but the odds are pretty good that I'm still not. Now, the second thing is, how do you do that? Well, you just, you don't do that voluntarily. You don't wake up one morning and say, I'd like to do that. But you have to figure out whether you're right or not, and then you have to figure out whether it's worth it or not, and then you have to do whatever you got to do.
Stop right there. What made you, was it your conscience that said, this is right? You said you were an American citizen, you were...
My conscience told me this was right, yes. My conscience told me the NAACP and the American Civil Liberties Union were right also, and I didn't pick up the first male opportunity I had to join. I was confronted.
So you're saying it was always in your life, this confrontation, where you had to make an ethical decision?
I'm saying that precisely what has happened with almost every social movement in the country, and certainly with the movement for civil rights in this country, is that the conduct of the oppressed was such that it confronted the oppressors. And if you witness that, then the old line from the labor days is, which side are you on? And if it confronts you directly, then you'd either do your duty or you don't. I didn't do anything. I didn't do one thing that a lawyer shouldn't do. I did only what a lawyer should do.
Then why weren't there more lawyers? And in this case, specifically white lawyers that would take civil rights cases in Alabama.
I don't know. You'll have to ask them.
Well, we've tried, and nobody will give us an answer
Well, in
to
the
that.
first place, a lot of them don't go. I mean, I can think if I were black, there would be a world of lawyers I wouldn't enter into the office asking to represent me. If I were a member of the Communist Party, for instance, I wouldn't just search out some of these lawyers around town here and and ask them to represent me. Now, me, I was pretty well treated by these lawyers around here. Remind you, don't think for a minute I wasn't. There were two things I was doing. I was doing a lot of the dirty work, and it was clean to me and clean to the world, but I was doing a lot of the things they didn't have to do, and I had a lot of friends. I mean, I was president of the junior bar section, the young lawyers bunch here. I was in charge of sundry things in the Bar Association. I started out with a corporate firm here in town. I had a world of friends. I was active in politics, and I still do, and I haven't lost those friends. I still see them now. I see those lawyers now, many of them, the ones who are still living, and I don't have the problem with them, and they didn't have a problem with me. I went to a bar dinner the other night here in Birmingham. Why, I might as well have been returning to a family reunion with a lot of folks. But the fact of the matter is that I chose a different course than they did. Many of them respected that course. A lot of them were on the other side, politically and otherwise. And I can't expect them, if they're on the other side, politically and otherwise, to stand around applauding me.
But Chuck, you suffered a lot financially in a lot of different ways, and yet you kept plowing ahead. For example,
But every
segregation.
single thing that I suffered along the way financially, if you will look back over that as life went on, everything came out very well.
Sure, you can take it with perspective, but I can remember walking in your house in Mountain Brook with searchlights going on the front door that stayed on 24 hours a day.
Well, now, they were just kind of big lawn lights. They were not searchlights in that sense. I mean, but they were there because I thought a place should be well lit in Birmingham.
Now, be honest about that. You had had threats, your family had had threats, your child had had threats. Being a white man, taking some civil rights cases.
I don't believe a child had threats.
But you had threats.
Well, that was all right, sure, but I expected that. Yeah, I had a lot of threats, sure.
And what about, so did you fear for your life ever?
Of course.
You would go across the tracks and meet with Orzel Billingsley carrying a gun sometimes in your cases.
I didn't carry one much, but I had a permit to carry one, and I did sometimes have a thing that would protect me in my briefcase, sure.
Do you think you could have used it?
Do I think I could have used it? Well, I mean, what a strange question.
I don't think it's strange.
You don't
at all.
think anybody ever carried one of those things and didn't think they could use it?
You still carry a gun.
No,
Why?
I don't want to.
Why did you carry it then?
Well, I didn't want to then.
But you felt you had to.
From time to time. Not every day, not much. I've always thought they were more trouble than they were worth, usually. But there were events and things that came along that from time to time told me that I should be able to defend myself against people who were not interested in fist fighting.
What was the response of your mother and father, Camille, your wife, to your outspoken stand on a variety of different things? And we're going to get into some of these cases in just a minute, which are famous now. But what was their response? Did they ever say, Chuck, pull back? Don't be so outspoken.
Not my wife, no, never.
Your mother and father? Your brother?
No, not my brother ever. I think my mother and father were worried about me not making it. And so consequently, they would express that concern from time to time. But as far as my wife was concerned, no, not from the moment that not from the moment the subject first came up have we disagreed on it.
Despite the fact that your life was threatened, despite the fact that you had to live under lights because you like to use your term,
I didn't live under lights. Now, don't listen. It was nothing compared with people like Shores and folks like that who had an entire neighborhood with no policemen around. You know, I'm telling you, I'm living in Mountain Brook. Now, if I were sitting over someplace and worrying about doing something to somebody, about the last place I'd like to go if I were from, I'm not going to mention the area of Birmingham, something like that, a white steelworker or somebody else, am I going to trot out to Mountain Brook to do something? My good Lord, man. That's about as foreign as, it's foreign in a different way, the same way the black community is, but a different way.
Let's talk about some of the most famous cases. Certainly desegregating juries, Chuck. I mean, you had some failures in that, but you saw in the beginning that that had to happen quickly.
Well, because of my experience in Birmingham practicing law, I understood, because of my experience generally in Alabama with politics, I knew that black folks had to have some power. And the power that blacks could get, of course, is the vote. And without the right to vote, everything else would fail. Now, the instruments of power in our democracy are generally, the first power is the power of the vote. A power just as important is the power of being on a jury. If you had all white juries, as we did generally throughout the state of Alabama, the jury can do anything to you. The jury is what takes your life away. The jury can take away your property. The jury can take away everything. Therefore, that's one of the great instruments of power in a democracy. We talk about the police and the lawyers and this and that, but the jury, that's the essence of power. The vote is the essence of power in a democracy. Now, when I started practicing here, women couldn't serve on juries. Blacks didn't serve on juries except in some areas in small numbers. They'd show up 1, 2, or 3, in the panel. With women, I filed a case called White versus Crook in Lowndes County, Alabama. I like that name. White was Gardenia White, and she was black. Crook was Bruce Crook, and he was the jury commissioner. He was white, and filed that, but also added into that complaint the question of the exclusion of women from juries. And it's my recollection that that was the first application of the Equal Protection Clause to the rights of women with respect to a matter of that nature. So, in that one case, I struck down, we managed to desegregate the juries of Lowndes County, and secondly, managed to take away the ban on women, white and black, from serving on juries in the state of Alabama. Those cases, those jury cases, were filed county by county by county. I would have somebody, and this is, much of this is after I left here and went with I was Southern Director. I left Birmingham in late 63. By 64, I was back in Atlanta. And in 64, I then organized the ACLU Southern Regional Office, American Civil Liberties Union Southern Regional Office, and consequently filed lawsuits across the South. So when I left here, I didn't leave for long, and I didn't leave for real, as some might say, because then it was in Alabama counties, numbers of them, not just 1, 2, or 3, that a lawsuit would be filed against the jury commissioners to require the desegregation of juries, and they would be filed in a federal court. And then we would move to desegregate the juries, and statistically they would have to come up and make sure that they met generally the population in the area. Well, that's the transfer of power that nobody much sees or notices looking back at it. But that's one of the strongest instruments of power that exists. Very few things in the society can take away your life, legally. Take away your property, legally.
Could the state have changed everything if they could have passed a law in the legislature to desegregate juries? And the answer is, of course. Some states did, didn't they?
No.
None in the South.
In the South? Not when I was doing this, no.
Okay.
I mean,
so you went county by county in Alabama particularly.
In Alabama? Well, I always had a great desire to see that Alabama changed. I mean, I had the whole South. And we had other organizations working, and I worked with them. And whether it was in Mississippi or Georgia, we had lawyers and organizations. And ultimately, you raised money in the North, and the money flowed south, and it became a major industry for folks. And you had lawyers all across the way, and we had lawyers in particular states. And so we filed lawsuits with them, and black lawyers, white lawyers, whatever. But all of those things were devoted and dedicated to redistributing power. There was not, I mean, I wasn't that, the traditional way to do it is you defend a black man charged with a crime, and you raise the question of systematic exclusion of Negroes from the grand or petit juries. And after you raise the question, you see, you get it in the record, and you go up and appeal the case, and you get the conviction reversed, and he doesn't go to death because you've proved racial discrimination in the selection of the jury. But you see, what I did was different. We fashioned an answer out of a little arcane reference to a couple of cases, and the answer was file suit in federal court against the state court and jury officials, and put them under an injunction, because when you used to raise the question for blacks defendants, it would go away. The whole thing would go away. No, well, he'd go away. Then you'd turn around, retry him, whatever else it is. Then after the court ruled, you'd have the juries about the same way. This way, we put them under a court order, and we went back and policed it. And I don't care whether the county was Lowndes or Barber, Bullock, wherever across the South. We did that. And then the second place was in the voting rights cases.
Before we get to that, also, which is sort of right with it, because you always talked about segregated justice from cradle to grave,
Oh, sure.
lack of justice for
I'd
the
live
black
with
man
that.
particularly.
There was no way, you see, I can be critical, and I sometimes am, of some companions that I had. But imagine what you do if you walk into a courthouse and you raise the racial questions if you're a white lawyer in those years. You earn your living there. You got a wife and kids at home. You got a mortgage on your house just like everybody else. You look at it and you know you have an obligation to raise the question of systematic exclusion of Negroes from juries. But you know if you do so that you'll have to give up your livelihood, the town you've lived in, your mothers and fathers and everybody else around, your wives and children, your children be hooted. Now, under that circumstance, that's quite a burden to be on a lawyer, or to any other citizen, who lives someplace. Well, that's what was confronted. There were a lot of lawyers who didn't like that system. But if they did something about it, the natural laws of economics did them in. Now, I understood that. I'd been through all that. So when I went with the ACLU, I used the ACLU and it used me, but I used it and grant funds. And all across the South hired lawyers to file lawsuits, to desegregate juries that even some of them later would be trying cases in.
Also, you desegregated prisons. I mean, the Caliph Washington case, along with Orzel Billingsley, you'd been fighting this for years.
The whole justice system, jury cases, the prison system, you name it, all of it is a part of the instrument of power. The basic instrument of power in any society and culture is to do one of two things: kill someone or put them in jail. That's the way the world works. Now, I understood that. And I understand it today. Lots of people today don't seem to understand that. It's what I would refer to as kind of murky, miasmic liberalism. I mean, the world would be nice, but that's called power. And I knew something about politics, and I knew that was a way that you change things, was to alter power, not so that whites wouldn't be serving, but so that you would desegregate and integrate. And you know why you want to integrate? You want to integrate because that means that black folks and white folks both talk differently. They say things differently when white folks are around, black folks do, and white folks say things differently than black folks are around. That's just the nature of human beings. Everybody forgets about the nature of human beings.
So you decided to use the federal government in a new way to desegregate juries, to get people to desegregate prisons. But the classic case, of course, and you had a lot of help here, was the one man, one vote. You saw reapportionment as absolutely fundamental to changing the state. In other words, they were all part of a large scheme, were they not, Chuck?
I could see something that other people didn't see. They still don't see it, and they still don't understand it, and they may never. It doesn't matter a whit. Somebody will see it. If you have a state legislature, as Alabama did, that was created in 1901 and designed to make certain that certain agricultural interests ruled the area, and designed in such a way that you'd have a state senator from, say, Lowndes County and a state member of the House or two, and that this state senator and the state senator from Wilcox and the state senator from X County and Y County, that all these people had great power in a 35-person Senate, and Jefferson County with 642,000 people ultimately, about 1940 as I recall it. Jefferson County had 1 vote in the state legislature and the state senate too, 7 members of the House. Other places had, 2, 3 members of the House. Every county had 1. 67 counties had 1 House member. Therefore, the apportionment of the state meant that a vote of a person in Jefferson County, white or black, was minuscule compared with the votes of people in those other counties. Now, how do you change the state? Well, in the first place, if the black belt of the state, named incidentally, if anybody ever watches this, not because of the population, it is said, but because of the color of the soil, the black belt of the state ran the operation, and the black belt of the state's interested in what? Cheap labor. What's the cheapest labor? Well, slave labor was pretty expensive. It got cheaper after Reconstruction. And so you've got all the crops and all the black folks living on the farm, and how do you control folks who live on a farm? They see you've got more than they got. Well, the strangest thing is you sometimes do it with guns, whips, knives, chains, the sheriff, and the county jail. Now, how do you do something about that? Well, the first thing you do is you desegregate juries. Simultaneously, you better desegregate the voter rolls. Because if you have a democracy, the real power lies in the voter rolls. And so simultaneously started filing voting discrimination cases and working with those who did across the black belts also. And in the ACLU years, it was just wonderful. I mean, it was like, there I was in Atlanta, Georgia, and I had people all over the United States who were contributing money and foundations and others for me to go out and hire lawyers and to get people to do things and try cases myself and take them to the Supreme Court to alter the law and to alter the distribution of power in the southern states, not just Alabama. Alabama was my favorite always. Alabama was always my favorite, but the fact that it was a favorite doesn't mean that it was the
only one.
It was the only one. That's right.
Where were you in the push to vote in '64 during Selma? Were you working behind the scenes? I'm leaping ahead to the Voting Rights Act now, and I know that concerns you deeply. But talk a little bit about where you were at that time. You were with the ACLU in Atlanta.
I was in the ACLU in Atlanta in 1964. I left here in '63.
Right.
Left Alabama in '63, and was in '64, and the Voting Rights Act was proposed, but '64 is the year for the Civil Rights Act.
That's right, '64.
That's public accommodations to the rest of that. I lived in Washington then, and then moved to Atlanta, I guess, later in that year of, it was a year later. I left here in '63. Late in '64, I moved to Atlanta. Now, in '65, you had the Selma to Montgomery March and those things, and the Voting Rights Act.
Right.
And you see, we also had a Department of Justice back then, and I liked those people. A lot of people don't like the Department of Justice, but I always thought they were pretty good folks. And Burke Marshall headed up the Department of Justice, and John Doerr was in the Department of Justice as number 2, and in the Civil Rights Division. And Bob Kennedy was the Attorney General of the United States. And whatever people may say about any Kennedy, any place, Robert Kennedy was hard-minded, tough, and he was devoted and dedicated to making the United States live by its promise and carrying that promise forward to the South. So, I liked him. I mean, personally and otherwise, and I liked these other folks personally and otherwise. And they took care of their things, and I tried to take care of things that they couldn't take care of, and things that they couldn't handle all these lawsuits. They could break down this statute and that sort of statute. They had all sorts of things going for them. Then Jack Kennedy was assassinated, of course, soon after, in the fall of '63. Well, then in came Lyndon Johnson. And you see, Lyndon Johnson, Southern as he is, was a man who understood power. You don't have to be a walking around genius to understand power. And Lyndon Johnson was probably both, a walking around genius, and he understood power. And he knew that one way to alter that power in the South was to alter the vote. Now, he knew that that was the right thing to do, too. And so he embarked upon the vote. So if you can take care of the votes, and if you can take care of the jury structure and the justice system, And then lastly, if you can take care of the
Reapportionment.
well, I mean, you've got that. If that's the vote, I consider the reapportionment case in those cases, all of them having to do with the vote down the line. And when you get through, you change those two things, then education, you see, has to fall in the center of that. You can't educate people or get money for education or do anything else unless you got a decent legislature, a decent voter set of rolls, and a decent set of people who are not going to be able to kill people with impunity. And they've got juries to protect that. So, by working on the instruments of power, I came to these conclusions in Birmingham. I mean, nobody sat around and philosophized with me about this. I mean, I could see this from the University of Alabama right straight on through. I understood power. And I had a lot of folks who were more miasmic than I was in civil rights things. They did other things. They were interested in, I understood what had to be done to give people a playground in which they could all operate, a place where they could debate back and forth, where people could hear different arguments. And that's what I did. I did that for 8 years out of Atlanta.
Chuck, let's go back to 1963. The thing, if you said to X number of people in Birmingham, Chuck Morgan, they would say, I remember when he said, and they'll quote, Birmingham is dead, which is not exactly how you said it in that famous speech before the YMBC. That happened in '63 after 4 little girls were killed at the 16th Street Church. Do you want to address the climate that led up to that bombing that certainly was a turning point in your life?
No, and I don't think it was an event in my life. I mean, I know that that was an important event in my life. It was a terrible thing to have happen, and it sickened me. But I can't recount those events.
Why did you determine to give that speech in the first place?
Well, I could.
Because you were so outraged?
Well, it was nothing else. Yeah, sure. I mean, I didn't sit down and rationally say, hi there, I think I'll go give a speech. Hey, let's go to Gettysburg. No, that's not any of that. I mean, I just, I was furious. That's why.
You said something there that, having just recently
I was sick. The whole thing was sickening.
But you said we're all to blame.
Well, of course, and we were.
Address that a little bit.
Well, we're in a democracy. When the people's will is carried out by bombing kids at a church, that's pretty close to seeing who did it. I don't have to. I'm not a great one to wake up one morning and say corporate guilt is the way of the earth. I'm not talking about that. But I lived in Birmingham, Alabama. I knew who the hell did it. I didn't have to. I wasn't born yesterday, but I didn't have the capacity to rationalize. Most people did, because I could see things they didn't see. Or at least I was willing to look. But there was nothing great about that. I didn't do anything. It was all these people talked about courage and this and that and all that sort of routine. I only did, you see, what I couldn't keep from doing. People don't understand that. Other people could keep from doing it who agreed with me. I just didn't have the way, I couldn't do that.
Let's talk a little bit about practicing law in Birmingham, Alabama for two black lawyers that you worked very closely with, most notably Orzel Billingsley and Arthur Shores. What was it like? This is before there was any desegregation, before your famous cases on juries, before your famous cases with the prisons. What was it like the first time you came in contact with somebody like Arthur Shores or Orzel Billingsley? How did they practice law? How could they practice law in this highly segregated society?
Well, it was very hard because they didn't have any power. They had a little bit of...
That's your theme, isn't it? That's the theme of everything.
It's not the theme. It's the theme of democracy in the world and life. I mean, it's nothing I thought of. Human beings who are interested in politics understand a little bit about power to start with. And human beings that are interested in law ought to understand something about power. And the real question is, did Orzel Billingsley and Arthur Shores have power? They had about 9,000 black votes, as I recall it. 9 to 10 or 12,000 black votes in the period of time in Birmingham and Jefferson County. And that was a semblance of power. A little bit, but not much. Orzel was... I drank with Orzel a good bit. We'd go off someplace, his house or somewhere, never Mountain Brook. We didn't go out there. But and Arthur was not a person who was that way. He and Orzel were close. And I did not work with them in any number of cases. Orzel was a plaintiff of mine in one case, the Billingsley versus Clayton, a jury case. Or maybe that was his brother.
That was his father.
Father, yes,
Father,
his
right.
daddy.
Yeah.
Yeah, his daddy. Orzel, that's a funny story. I'll try to think if I want to tell that one. But these were people that I saw. It was a segregated society. I didn't see them any place except at Orzel's house. I mean, I was closer to Orzel than Arthur. Arthur was pretty straight-laced, and he was a fella. Orzel drank a good bit, and he was Arthur was a representative of, the business interests in the community and the NAACP and the rest of it. But Orzel and the other young lawyers, there's some younger lawyers around too, or black lawyers, and I thought they were brilliant in many ways. I'm not talking about scholastically. I don't know what they did in law school. But they could find a remedy and think of something to do. Problem was that they were crippled.
Because?
Because they lived in a segregated society in which all the power was in the hands of white folks.
And being crippled, they also didn't have access to some of the libraries, did they, Chuck?
Oh, well, they didn't have access to the rest of that. But see, there are people who can practice law without much law libraries. But in Birmingham, I discovered one day at the Birmingham Law Library, I told somebody this the other day. I was over at the Birmingham Law Library and looking for something, and I noticed all these people who worked there who weren't helping anybody do anything. About 4 of them I counted. And I counted particularly because there I am in the old courthouse, Jefferson County Courthouse, and I'm wandering along and searching for something. And I looked over there at a little room over there, and there used to be a room in there. There was a little, on the 6th floor of the courthouse, had an elevator to take you upstairs to the law library. And in the law library was an old man there, gray-haired, short little fella, nice fella as far as I was concerned, named Charlie White. The Birmingham Bar Association ran that library. Well, black folks couldn't even be members of the Birmingham Bar Association. They had their own private bar association. And it was one of the great revelations of my life was to discover that Orzel or Peter Hall or whoever it was would go over to the library, law library, and they couldn't go in the law library and get a book. They get up there and put them in a little room, like the little room I was sitting in. And then the law librarian, Charlie White, would bring them books. They'd tell him what they wanted, and he'd come over and bring the books back to them. Now, of course, I started to say to somebody the other day, desegregation has resulted now in a law library where the librarians don't even bring white lawyers' books. But there was Charlie White working along the way for carrying the books over to the black lawyers. There were 1,000 things that were strange and absurd looking back at them. But you see, they were all designed to a purpose. And the purpose was to make sure that white people, just because of their race, remained in power. Nothing else. And 1,000 rationalizations, but that's what was involved. To a great degree, that's involved in a lot of politics today even. Now we're talking about 30 years later. And I imagine it'll be involved 30 more years from now. Ultimately, if things continue to work along the way, and we have democracy along the way, and to continue the Constitution, if the Supreme Court comes in, that'll enforce it and that sort of thing, we'll find that those problems will go away. But that comes from something called integration. It's not, there's been a lot of integration in the South. You can see it by the sundry shades of black folks. Now, all these artificial distinctions of race, religion, you can't even tell what somebody's religion is till you see them. But people all over the world, until you know what it is, people all over the world kill each other over religion. Well, they see race. They kill each other over race. And it's just as, most things in life are very simple. You don't have to be an honor graduate of the Alabama Law School to understand, Harvard or Yale. The problem with the law and the problem with education, it gives people a way to think, quote, rationally, or, put it another way, to rationalize. And when they rationalize away most of the things they might have done. which could have changed something along the way, along life's road. And I have seen many people do that. And I have not, I haven't written them off. I have a world of friends here who disagreed with me. And over the years, they just, I'd see some in Atlanta and some other places, those 8 years in Atlanta, 4 years in Washington. And all these folks, I just say I didn't lose a lot of old friends. I knew a world of people.
But Chuck,
I made a lot of new enemies.
But you might very well have seen things differently, and I want to get to the core of why you did, because aside from just what you did in Alabama and when you were with the ACLU in juries and one man, one vote and prisons and so forth, you also defended unpopular causes, not the least of whom was Muhammad Ali, who was Cassius Clay, who didn't want to go and work in the Vietnam War. The Levy case, a dermatologist who also did not want to serve in the Vietnam War. Did the ACLU give you that kind of cover, or why did you decide to take those cases? Those were individual. That was not a question of power. That was individual.
Let me tell you something. The day that the ACLU, in a time like the Vietnam War, gives somebody, quote, cover, end quote, that is the day that the organization should dissolve. Now, when I left here and went to Washington, I worked for the American Association of University Professors for a while after I finished A Time to Speak. And then after that, the American Civil Liberties Union decided that, lo and behold, the poor benighted Southerners needed some help and needed some emancipation. And so consequently, they wanted to organize a Southern regional office of the ACLU. It was also, in the liberal jargon, or whatever you want to put it, was pretty good business, as the ACLU Southern office raised enough money to handle it and probably raise some more money extra to boot. But there were foundation heads all across the country who were interested in the South, many of them having been Southerners. The guys who ran them. And so consequently, when I was in the Southern office of the ACLU, grants came. And with those grants, I could do something that we hadn't done before. I put maybe 15 or 10 or 20 lawyers on a retainer. They were black, most of them. Some were white. Every month. Why? I wanted them to be able to practice where they were and live, eat. I understood that. See, if you can eat and sleep, have a place to live, food, shelter, and clothing, then you're likely to be around and handle cases. Now, the Vietnam War came along, and as the Vietnam War came, it got in the way. It was just a terrible inconvenience for the civil rights movement. I'm in Atlanta, Georgia, and there's Julian Bond, who's a friend and a client. Here he is in the Georgia legislature. They want to throw him out. I wind up in a case called Bond versus Floyd. I've already in Reynolds versus Sims, or Sims versus Frank is the way we filed it. And I've done that. I guess I argued that case in '64. Now I'm in Atlanta. When I'm in Atlanta, I'm back in Atlanta in '64. Argued Reynolds versus Sims in the Supreme Court of the United States in '64. '65.
Excuse me, Chuck. I had to do.
That's all right. It's tough living. It's hard living. They'll do that to you, Betty. In '65, when you go along, then the Voting Rights Act comes in, and all these things are there. So there's another thing coming along, and it's the Vietnam War. I see the Vietnam War got in the way. It was a terrible inconvenience for the social revolution that was underway. It's very difficult to have a social revolution in a time of war. War does things to people and governments. I don't know where you read this, but if it's readable, any place. But war does things to people that other things don't do to them and to nations. When you've got an, quote, enemy out there, then the war effort takes precedence. Well, what we did with the civil rights movement, you see, is it's existing in the time of the Vietnam War. And people like Martin King and others move against the war. In the first place, Martin King was a Christian. People keep forgetting that. They think of Martin Luther King as a, quote, civil rights leader, or as a great speaker, or as an excellent writer, or as a PhD from Boston. But Martin King was a Christian. And most Christians understand there's something wrong with war. Most of them don't mind it much, but they know there's something wrong with war. Well, Martin King knew there was something wrong with war. The old spirituals knew there was something wrong with war. Lots of people saying they ain't going to go to war no more. And along with that comes the Vietnam War. And at that juncture, people in the United States look at that and they say, what in God's green earth are we doing in Vietnam? Now, as far as I'm concerned, I don't particularly want to get involved in the war. I'm interested in other things. But the war keeps getting in the way. I mean, the war is in the way of the social revolution going on in the United States. War generally kills social revolutions. Well, something happened with the Vietnam War. It was a little bit different. The social revolution may have been killed by the war. May not have, and I doubt that it has. But secondly, it also killed the war. And the Vietnam War was there, and somebody...
But you took individual cases, Chuck. I mean, King certainly got to be very unpopular with a lot of the good folk, the liberal folk that were beginning to accept him and what he had done in the civil rights movement. But when he came out, I can remember him doing it just before Memphis and when he was killed, when he came out and A, talked about the garbage workers and organizing, and B, when he talked against the war. Yeah. Everybody said, well, he's too radical.
Now, just look at that. Here's a man who goes out and says garbage workers should be organized and should be paid more. Now, there are very few citizens of this world who don't know that garbage workers should have been organized and should have been paid more. Today they are. They are organized in many cases, and they are paid more. They work for private contractors today, generally throughout the country. But back then, when King did that, there are just a lot of folks who hate anybody who was on the side of working class people making more money. I mean, I just wake up every morning. You can find people who are opposed to that. They're in high office. They're in office today. They were in office 20 years ago. They were in office 100 years ago. They'll be in office another 100 years from now, maybe, unless the world is changing so rapidly through certain kinds of things that there's no need to go in. And Newt and I understand them. I don't think Newt understands it very well. He says he does, but what you have is King moving over into the anti-war movement also, but his understanding being different than that of others. People were critical of him. Many liberals, who were for civil rights, were critical of that because of two reasons. First of all, King was then opposed to a Democratic president who was liberal on the general issues of civil rights. So a number of liberals allied themselves with that president. I liked that president myself. I didn't write him off. I differed with him on the war, but I didn't, write him off on that score. And some people looked at Martin King. People are constantly looking at people like Martin King, and they want to find a reason to be against him anyway. I mean, who is this fellow out there? Is he so saying, what kind of a life is he really? Is he really a fellow who's a Christian? Is he really a good man? Why, he's got feet of clay someplace. We got to get down there and unzip those shoes and look at them. Now, when the war kept getting in the way, so if I get a call from Chauncey Eskridge, who was also a lawyer for Martin King and others, and I think this is the way it happened, and for SCLC, and he asked me if I'll go out and help defend Muhammad Ali in his draft case in Houston, the answer is, of course I will. I mean, after all, I'm being paid a salary by the American Civil Liberties Union. Hell, they ain't for anything unfair in the draft. And I go out there to Houston, and I meet him the first day, and we were standing down in front of the federal courthouse one time out there, coming out, and he looked around, and there was a television reporter with a hair shaded just about like yours, and she was with NBC, as I recall it, and there was this big crowd of people as we walked out of the federal court, and we stood there for a minute, and I'm standing there, and the cameras are on him, and of course I'm with him, so I'm on camera occasionally along the way, and these questions are asked, and one of the questions she asked of Muhammad Ali, she says, is it true that you don't work with any white people or something like that? Or you don't like white people or something like that? And he gave some answer to him like, oh, yeah, that's right, or whatever. And when the camera came back around, whatever it was, and her turn came again, she says, well, you have said that you don't like any white people, but he's your lawyer. No, He's your lawyer, and what do you don't have any friends, you say, who are white. And his answer, quick as lightning, was just like this. He said, he's my lawyer, not my friend. And you see, there are a lot of people who don't understand that kind of distinction even. Now, in fact, we did get along pretty well. Later he turned around to me and he says, they'll stop at nothing to drive us apart, something like that. But the fact of the matter is that the war got in the way. And so when Howard Levy gets in difficulty and asks for help, or somebody asks for help, sure, I went up and defended him.
Okay, but then the other famous cases, and did the Watergate get in the way of the civil rights movement? I mean, your goal has always been one thing, to bring about social justice in this country. I think I can say that fairly. Can't I, Chuck?
Well, I think you can say that. Also, I've done other things along the way. I've gotten to be rich and well-born and able myself. I've made a bit of money.
But let's go before we get to that, and we'll get to that in a minute. But let's just talk about those things that have large social import. The Watergate trial was another one. You were called in as an ACLU lawyer, is that correct, to defend those who went into the Watergate?
Not to defend the ones who went into the Watergate, no.
The victims of the Watergate.
The victims were the Democrats.
Right.
The Association of State Democratic Chairmen had a working wiretap on their telephone.
Right.
And I was now fresh in Washington. I was I'd left Atlanta, and I was director of the ACLU's Washington national office, not the local office, but the national office. And some folks came to me and asked me to defend represent a fellow named Spencer Oliver. And his phone was the one tapped by a working wiretap by Baldwin or others, or bugged. And in the Watergate, he was the chairman of the Young Democrat, I've forgotten exactly the name of it, but it was of a Democratic Party organization, and they had him tapped. And the question then became, what can we do about that? So I filed a motion to suppress the contents. Pretty good memory here, because I hadn't prepared for any of this. A motion to suppress the contents of illegally intercepted oral and wire communications. Now, filed that motion in Sirica's court to exclude the contents of any wire, any intercepted conversations. Now, that my interest was defending the client. In all these cases, it's been, unless I'm filing an affirmative lawsuit for the client, or a lawsuit to break down segregation, or something that I've dreamed up and going, at it affirmatively. Otherwise, your duty as a lawyer is to defend your client. And it doesn't matter who your client is. He can be right wing, left wing, black, white, whatever. And in this particular case, I'm defending a client by and a political entity by moving to suppress the contents of those conversations. The prosecutor said he's going to introduce the conversations to show the reason for the Watergate wiretap. Well, I knew that the Watergate break-in wasn't because of my clients, or what they were saying on the telephone, or any of that sort of stuff, or what they could say on the telephone. But I filed the motion to do that, and went through that case, and I always knew that the people on the other side of that case were just like the people on other sides of some cases in the South, and that they were on the wrong side of the great questions that ordinarily face the citizens of the United States.
So you saw that as a large social issue also?
Well, the large social issue is who is going to run the country. In that instance, Richard Nixon was. And he did for a while. And then his party came along, and then Jimmy Carter came in for 4 years, and then the Republicans returned with Ronald Reagan, and they're in power right now. And their interests have not generally been the kinds of political interests that I've had. I mean, on tax rates, I guess I'd profit. But as far as the rest of it's concerned, no, I'm on the other side of most of the things those people are for.
Chuck, here it is, February 1995. The Republicans have taken over Congress, just for whomever listens to this and down in history, whatever. Be a little far-seeing. Where is the social revolution coming now? Where is it coming from? We're talking, I say we, the Congress, and particularly the Republican wing, is talking about dismantling everything, dismantling welfare, putting grants to the states. How far this will go in history, I don't know. But for this moment in time, address those things. That certainly isn't part of a larger social revolution that you knew. It's an entirely different kind of thing.
Without opposition, the Republican Party is moving to dismantle things that are for the good of the people, in my judgment. The Democratic Party, you see, doesn't manage to find itself capable of defending its own programs. It doesn't have either the heart or the will for that. Now, there's nothing really that I can do about that. I'm not going to run for president. But you see, under that circumstance, when everyone's afraid to confront the people, you see there's two things. Skepticism, I've always been skeptical of a lot of things, but cynicism is the death of a democracy. And the cynics of this world undermine it worse than any underground or subversive group in the whole history of the country could possibly do. Democracy, and our democracy particularly, with the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the 13th, 14th, and 15th. This democracy is an idealistic system that must live by ideals. And if it doesn't appeal to people's ideals, then it won't last. Now, one of the ways you undercut those ideals is cynicism. You always find some fault with something. The people didn't do this, or they didn't do that, or they made a mistake last year, or look who they elected, or my God, they elected Nixon, and gee, it'll never be the same again. Or gee, what happens here with so-and-so, and now we've got... Now, if you have a political party that is devoted to ideals, it must express those ideals, because one of the things that happens in a political campaign is the mass education of the populace. Blacks, whites, everybody else. Now, if you speak truth to power and to people, you gain power. But when you're cynical about it and you think the people don't have good sense, and you write them off, then you have no program, and they ordinarily vote for folks like they did in the last election.
Do you think the social revolution, looking back, here again I'm talking about the black-white revolution, which has been so important in the South, has it been a success? Do you see it, the obvious things, there have been more access by blacks to the system, as it were. But are we becoming more alienated one from another?
Oh, good God, who cares?
You don't care?
About alienation one from the other? Look, I would prefer to live in a society where people weren't mean to each other, where the world came along and everybody loved each other, where black folks and white folks got up every morning and went out there and Hattie McDaniel served the food and everybody stood there and sang to the heavens and everybody said, gee, here we are. That'd just be wonderful. But I don't know of that time that it's ever occurred in the history of the human race on a regular basis. It happens every now and then. Now, if you're in a society like our culture and society, and the things are out there, are we better off now than we were then? That's implicit in what you're saying.
That's exactly what it is.
The answer is every given day, every moment of every day. Sure, we're much better off, number two. Could it all be taken away? Well, probably not all of it, but a hell of a lot of it could. Number three, is the Democratic Party far better than the Republican Party today? Well, the Republican Party at least has certain principles and precepts. Those principles and precepts generally are meanness and unspoken hatred and fear. It's kind of the Midas touch. It's the money approach. And somehow some rules of economics and law say everything's going to be all right if we just adopt these rules of economics. And the Democratic Party goes around. They don't have organized labor. They don't have all those other kinds of backgrounds that they used to have. And they're floundering around. And all they ought to have is beliefs. That's all they need.
Could I summarize all of this and say, if we understand how power works, we can do something about constantly improving our society? Is that too simplistic, Chuck?
No, it's not simplistic. What the simple thing is, that in our society with freedom, access to information, the way people can get known and do things in this country, that if you do right, you ordinarily win. And if you win enough, the whole society wins. Blacks, whites, everybody in it. And if we never do that in the country for the really great way, we'll do it for the whole world.
Thanks, Chuck.
sweet in the morning. Oh,